So within about 100 years, the Egyptians had adopted the chariot and the type of bronze working that the Hyksos had used, and they were able to then expel the Hyksos in 1549 under the rule of Ahmose. And this marks the beginning of the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom of Egypt is the one that most people think about when we think about ancient Egypt, outside of the pharaohs. But when we think about the importance of Egypt, this is really the time period that people are focusing on. And this is a period of militaristic expansion and the establishment of extensive trade and connections and religious reformation. And it starts in 1549 when Ahmose drives the Hyksos out of Lower Egypt, and then he wages war, following the way of Horus here into southern Canaan, takes over the site of Gaza in particular. Okay. And this establishes Egyptian control of the Sinai and the southern Palestine, and this gives Egypt a gateway, right, using the way of Horus to then subsequently wage war against the Aramaeans here in Syria, the Mitanni in northern Syria, the Hittites here in central Turkey, Assyrian Empire in northern Mesopotamia, and the Babylonians in southern Mesopotamia. And so for the next 400 or 500 years or so, we see more or less a series of continuous wars, in particular trying to control this very rich region, Aramaean region of Syria, between the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the Egyptians. At its height, the empire controlled from the Mediterranean. It covered most of the western Mediterranean, from the foothills of the Taurus Mountains in Cilicia to the western bank of the Euphrates River Valley, and then covering down from the Jordan River Valley, Sea of Galilee, all the way down to the Wadi Araba, into the Red Sea. Now, we also see yearly military campaigns. Every year, the pharaoh, as a show of strength and power, would go on campaign, and they brought back the spoils of war. And it's a lot of the booty that is brought back that really fuels this system. And in particular importance, as you read about for today, are the military captives, the prisoners of war who were brought back and then forced into slavery. So I don't want to focus too much on individuals in the New Kingdom, but I do want to talk about a couple really important people. The first of which is Hatshepsut. She's the second female pharaoh of Egypt, but one of the most successful rulers of the New Kingdom. She comes to power when her 2-year-old stepson, Tutmose III, takes the throne. Of course, he's 2, so he can't really do anything. And she is his aunt and queen regent. So she comes to power and she rules more or less for the next 20 years. So until her stepson, her nephew, is 22, she maintains power. And Hatshepsut is really kind of interesting because even though she wages war in the early parts of her campaign, her burial temple here, which you see, is one of the most elaborate and intricate architecturally in all of Egypt during the time period. It records a series of campaigns against the Nubians to the south. But she's more or less gave up this kind of militaristic expansion in favor of an establishment of trade connections. So the Hyksos occupation really kind of disrupted Egypt's access to goods and materials. And so Hatshepsut basically reestablishes those connections, in particular at Punt. The kingdom of Punt in modern Ethiopia had the connections to India, the Indian subcontinent, and the Arabian Peninsula, and so lots of goods like spices and incense were all coming from the kingdom of Punt, and so she brings those back into Egyptian society and reestablishes those connections. She also undertakes an extensive building campaign, so much so that for the next 100 years or so after her death, other pharaohs are taking credit for her work. Right, and so we can kind of see her as an incredibly important consolatory figure of Egypt after the Hyksos rebellion. So Ahmose and his son Tutmose II, or Tutmose I, who was Hatshepsut's father, right? They basically expelled the Hyksos, expanded the militaristic apparatus around the Egyptian state, but it's Hatshepsut that then consolidated it and brought everything back into working bureaucratic order. And I think she's a kind of an important figure because she takes these kind of gendered norms of power and flips them on their head as a woman in control of a very patriarchal society. Now, a couple hundred years later, we also see what is called the Amarna period, and this is under the reign of Akhenaten. Um, around 1350 or so, Akhenaten changes his name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, and he changes the state religion of Egypt to worship the sun disk, Aten. He basically removes the worship of all these other deities and implements a semi-monotheistic worship of Aten. He moves the capital from Thebes, this important religious center, to Akhehatun, which is modern Amarna, and he destroyed and pillaged temples throughout Egypt in order to consolidate the power and the importance of his god. Now, the shift to the worship of Aten isn't necessarily this kind of religious experience by Akhenaten, but rather is likely largely aimed at limiting the influence of the temples, such as that of Amun at Karnak. Remember, these temple institutions have become incredibly important economically, and they're starting to throw that influence around to try to sway the pharaoh. And so Akhenaten is likely taking this as kind of a challenge to his authority. And so rather than kind of working to actively subdue within the system, he changes the system to limit the power of those institutions. So Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, they reconstruct worship of Egyptian society around themselves as the representative of the sun disk Aten. Now, Akhenaten, because of this, became an incredibly unpopular figure within Egypt upon his death. Upon his death, a series of his descendants took power and tried to maintain the system, and it ultimately resulted in his son Tutankhaten coming to power at age 8. But because he's 8, he's highly susceptible. He's convinced by his viziers to change his name to Tutankhamun, that is the beloved of Amun, and restore the religious traditions and practices. So Tutankhamun, that is King Tut, right, is a relatively insignificant pharaoh in terms of his power and rule, but he has a profound effect on the reconstruction of Egyptian society after the Amarna period. Now, and because of this, all of the monuments and temples constructed by Akhenaten were attempted to be destroyed. And they literally did the same thing they did to try with Hatshepsut. They tried to erase his memory from the landscape to kind of dissuade his heresy. Now, what makes this really kind of fascinating archaeologically is here we have a 30-year time span where the temple was built, a new temple is built, a new capital is built, it's occupied for an extremely short period of time, and then it's abandoned and destroyed. And so the Amarna excavations in Amarna are kind of a fascinating insight into Egyptian religious and political practice. So we also found a royal archive from Amarna that has about 350 cuneiform documents written in Akkadian, which is really kind of fascinating. But all point to the political connections of Egypt to the kingdoms in Israel, who were their vassals. And the Amarna letters are largely just pleas for assistance from Egypt's allies. And so you can kind of see this is Amarna tablet 287, and it's basically from the mayor of Jerusalem to the pharaoh, and he's like, hey, pharaoh, please, I need help. We're being attacked, right? So I've given you food, I've given oil, I've given supplies. Now come and help me fight off the Habiru, these kinds of nomadic peoples who are threatening my borders. So we can kind of see this as a representation here in the Amarna period of the importance of Egypt as that imperial political figure and all these vassal states from Damascus to Jerusalem, who were basically vying for power within the imperial system and asking the pharaoh for help. Now, the most famous king of the New Kingdom is Ramesses II, and that's largely because he ruled over Egypt for about 67 years. Right? He comes to power as a 16-year-old kid. He lives into his 80s, and Ramesses is generally the pharaoh that's mentioned in the Exodus. And so if there is a biblical connection to the story of the Jews in Egypt, it likely occurs under Ramesses. But he undertakes a massive building campaign, and he goes to war with the Hittites, and he fights the Hittites to a stalemate at Kadesh in modern Syria. And in 1275 we see the writing of the world's first peace treaty, an establishment of the boundaries of the Hittite and the Egyptian empires that consolidates power and control of northern Syria for the Egyptians.